The courtroom was quiet but charged with tension, like the calm before a storm. Rows of wooden benches stretched out on either side, filled with familiar faces from the neighborhood. On one side sat Patricia and her supporters, their expressions tight with determination. On the other side, I sat with Greg, my lawyer, beside me, feeling both nervous and resolute. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and stale coffee, and the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall echoed louder than it should have. When the judge entered, everyone stood up, and the room fell silent. He was an older man with sharp eyes that scanned the courtroom as if he could already sense the weight of what was about to unfold. After taking his seat, he gestured for the proceedings to begin. Patricia's lawyer went first, painting me as someone who had disrupted the harmony of the community for selfish reasons. "This is not just about parking," he argued passionately. "It's about a property owner disregarding the needs of her neighbors, causing unnecessary conflict, and violating the spirit of cooperation that holds our neighborhood together." I clenched my fists under the table, forcing myself to stay calm. It was infuriating how they twisted the truth, making me sound like the villain in this story. But I reminded myself that facts spoke louder than words, and we had plenty of them. When it was my lawyer's turn, he methodically laid out our case. Document by document, he exposed the HOA's financial mismanagement. Bank statements showed unexplained withdrawals. Emails revealed secret agreements between Patricia and certain members. Receipts detailed extravagant expenses disguised as community projects that never materialized. Each piece of evidence felt like another nail in Patricia's coffin. The turning point came when my lawyer presented a recording, a voicemail Patricia had left for one of her allies. In it, she openly admitted to ignoring complaints about illegal parking because it wasn't worth her time. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as the judge listened intently. Patricia's face turned pale, and for the first time, she looked genuinely rattled. Throughout it all, I kept my gaze steady, refusing to look away or show weakness. When the judge finally asked if I wanted to say anything, I stood up, my voice trembling slightly but clear enough to be heard. "This isn't about revenge or being difficult," I began, glancing around the room. "It's about fairness. My property was disrespected, and when I tried to enforce my rights, I was attacked, not just by the HOA but by people who thought they could intimidate me into giving up. This lawsuit isn't just about me. It's about holding the HOA accountable so no one else has to go through what I did." The silence that followed was deafening. Some neighbors avoided my eyes, while others nodded subtly, as if realizing for the first time how wrong things had become. By the end of the hearing, the outcome seemed inevitable. The judge ruled in my favor, ordering the HOA to pay damages for harassment and legal fees, and demanded they issue a public apology. More importantly, he stripped Patricia of her position as president, citing gross misconduct and abuse of power. As the gavel came down, a wave of relief washed over me, but it was bittersweet. Afterward, as I walked out of the courthouse, reporters swarmed me again, shouting questions about how it felt to win. But I barely heard them. All I could think about was how much this victory had cost, not just financially but emotionally. The neighborhood would never feel the same, and neither would I still. I knew one thing for sure: standing up for yourself, even when it's hard, is always worth it. When I first bought the old warehouse, I wasn't looking for anything fancy. It was just a big, empty space on the edge of town with high ceilings, exposed brick walls, and plenty of room to breathe. The best part: a huge parking lot right out front that could fit at least 20 cars. To me, it felt like freedom, a place where I could store things, maybe start a small business, or simply have some peace away from the noise of everyday life. At first, everything seemed perfect. The neighborhood around the warehouse was quiet, filled with families who took pride in keeping their lawns green and their driveways clear. They were friendly enough, waving hello when they saw me and occasionally stopping by to introduce themselves. I didn't mind. Being new in town, I wanted to make a good impression too. But then came the requests. One day, a neighbor named Mrs. Jenkins knocked on my door. She had this apologetic smile as she explained how her driveway was being repaved and asked if she could park her car in my lot for a few days. Just until the work is done, she promised. How could I say no? She seemed nice, and it was only one car. No big deal, right? A couple of days later, another neighbor stopped by with the same story. Then another. Before I knew it, my once empty parking lot started filling up. At first, it didn't bother me much. After all, these were temporary situations, or so I thought. But soon, more cars appeared without anyone asking permission. Some belonged to people I'd never even met. It got to the point where I couldn't tell which vehicles were mine and which weren't. I tried talking to the HOA, the group responsible for managing the neighborhood's rules. Surely they could enforce their own guidelines about street parking, right? That's what they're there for. So I called them, hoping for a solution. Instead, I ended up speaking with Patricia Langley, the HOA president. She sounded polite but dismissive, brushing off my concerns with vague reassurances. "We'll look into it," she said, though her tone made it clear she didn't think it was a priority. As the weeks went by, frustration built inside me. My parking lot wasn't just crowded anymore. It was completely overrun. Cars spilled over every available inch of asphalt, making it hard for me to use the loading dock or even walk through the space comfortably. And still, no one from the HOA stepped in to help. In fact, it almost felt like they were ignoring the problem on purpose, letting their members take advantage of my property while doing nothing to stop it. One rainy evening, I came home after a long day at work to find an unfamiliar van parked smack in the middle of the driveway leading to the loading dock. Its windshield wipers weren't working, water pooled under its tires, and there was no note explaining why it was there. Frustrated, I called the HOA again, hoping someone would know whose vehicle it was. Once again, I got Patricia. Her response was infuriatingly calm, as if she couldn't understand why I was upset about just one extra car. That night, lying awake in bed listening to the rain patter against the windows, I realized something had to change. Enough was enough. If the HOA wouldn't enforce their rules, then I'd have to handle it myself. The idea hit me suddenly, like a bolt of lightning. What if I towed all the cars? It sounded extreme, but the thought gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. Maybe towing would finally send a message that my property wasn't free real estate for everyone else to use whenever they wanted. The plan formed quickly in my mind. I grabbed my phone and dialed a local towing company, explaining the situation and asking if they could come first thing in the morning. As I hung up, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This was going to be messy, but deep down, I knew it was the only way to reclaim what was rightfully mine. Tomorrow, the neighborhood would wake up to a very different scene, and I couldn't wait to see their reactions. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, my heart racing with a mix of anticipation and dread. The air was crisp, and the sky still carried traces of night's darkness as I sipped my coffee, watching from my window for the tow truck to arrive. When it finally turned onto the street, its headlights cutting through the early morning fog, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction, like justice was rolling in on four wheels. As the driver got out and began hooking up the first car, neighbors started to emerge from their homes. At first, it was just one or two people peeking curiously out of their windows. But soon, the commotion drew a crowd. Some wandered over in pajamas and slippers, rubbing sleep from their eyes, while others stood at a distance, arms crossed and faces etched with confusion. It didn't take long for whispers to spread like wildfire. Is she really towing all these cars? Who does she think she is? One man marched straight up to me, his face red with anger. "What gives you the right to do this?" he demanded, pointing at the tow truck as if accusing me personally of some unforgivable crime. His tone was sharp, almost aggressive, but I refused to back down. "I own this property, I said firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "These cars are parked here illegally. Did anyone ask my permission?" "No. So yes, I have every right." His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, clearly unprepared for such a direct response. He stumbled backward, muttering something under his breath about calling the HOA. Meanwhile, Patricia Langley arrived on the scene, clipboard in hand, looking every bit the part of someone who had stepped out of a leadership seminar. Her polished appearance contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding around her. "This is unacceptable," she announced loudly, drawing everyone's attention. She spoke with authority, her voice carrying across the parking lot like she was addressing a courtroom. "You can't just tow people's cars without warning." I raised an eyebrow, unable to stop myself from laughing bitterly. "Funny coming from you," I shot back. "Because apparently, you can let them park illegally on private property without asking." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, she looked genuinely rattled. But true to form, she quickly recovered, turning to address the growing crowd instead. "This kind of behavior disrupts community harmony," she declared, gesturing dramatically toward the tow truck. "We need to work together, not create division." "Community harmony," I echoed incredulously. "How does letting people use my property without permission supposed to promote harmony? This isn't your land. It's mine." By now, the entire neighborhood seemed to be gathered around us, forming a loose circle that made me feel both cornered and oddly empowered. People shouted questions and accusations, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. A few even tried reasoning with the tow truck driver, pleading with him to stop what he was doing. One woman burst into tears, claiming she'd left her groceries inside her car. Another man threatened to call the police, though when he actually did, they sided with me since the cars were indeed on private property. Despite the chaos, I couldn't help but notice how much quieter Patricia became as the morning wore on. For someone who prided herself on control, seeing her plans unravel must have been infuriating. Still, she wasn't ready to give up. Before leaving, she leaned in close enough for only me to hear. "This isn't over," she hissed, her smile brittle and forced. Then she turned on her heel and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. By noon, the parking lot was empty except for my SUV. The tow truck driver tipped his hat as he drove off, leaving behind an eerie silence that felt heavier than the noise from earlier. Neighbors lingered for a while longer, casting suspicious glances in my direction before slowly dispersing. As I stood there alone, surveying the now barren lot, I realized I'd won this round. But the battle was far from finished. Word travels fast in neighborhoods like this, and I knew the backlash would come sooner rather than later. But for now, I allowed myself a small victory lap. The warehouse, and its parking lot, was mine again. The calm after the storm didn't last long. By the time I went to bed that night, I could already feel the tension simmering beneath the surface of the neighborhood. It was as if the air itself had changed. Thicker, heavier, charged with an unspoken hostility. I tossed and turned, unable to shake the feeling that something was coming. And sure enough, by morning, the backlash began. When I stepped outside to check my mailbox, I noticed a faint hissing sound coming from the direction of my SUV. At first, I thought it might be a tire slowly losing air, but when I got closer, my stomach dropped. All 4 tires had been slashed. Jagged cuts ran across the rubber like angry scars, deflating not just the tires, but also any lingering hope that this conflict would blow over quietly. My hands trembled as I inspected the damage, anger bubbling up inside me. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a message, a clear warning that they weren't going to let me win without a fight. But the slashed tires were only the beginning. Over the next few days, things escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Anonymous notes started appearing on my windshield, each one nastier than the last. Some accused me of being selfish and heartless, while others made vague threats about consequences. One note even suggested I'd ruined Christmas for the neighborhood kids, which seemed ridiculous since it was only October. Still, The absurdity didn't make the words sting any less. Then there were the pranks. Eggs splattered against my windows almost daily, forcing me to spend hours cleaning up the mess. Someone dumped garbage bags full of leaves onto my driveway, apparently hoping to block access to the warehouse. Even worse, cars would drive by at all hours of the night, their headlights blinding me through the curtains. Each incident felt like another brick being added to the wall of animosity between me and the rest of the neighborhood. Greg tried to stay supportive, but I could tell he was worried. Maybe we should talk to them, he suggested one evening, watching me scrub egg yolk off the glass. Try to smooth things over before it gets worse. Smooth things over, I snapped, louder than I intended. They're the ones who broke the rules, not me. Why should I have to apologize? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not saying you're wrong, but sometimes picking your battles is smarter than fighting every single one. His words lingered in my mind, gnawing at me like a splinter I couldn't quite pull out. Was he right? Should I back down? The thought of giving in made my blood boil, but deep down, I knew he had a point. This wasn't just about towing cars anymore. It had become personal, and the more entrenched I got, the harder it was to see a way out. To make matters worse, Patricia wasted no time escalating things legally. A certified letter arrived in the mail a few days later, accusing me of operating a commercial towing operation without proper permits. The accusation was laughable. I hadn't profited from towing anyone's car, but the legal jargon made it sound serious enough to intimidate most people into submission. Reading it felt like a punch to the gut. They weren't just trying to punish me, they were trying to scare me into backing off. And honestly, it worked, for a little while. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, doubt crept in. What if I couldn't keep fighting? What if the cost of standing my ground ended up being too high? These questions swirled in my mind late at night, keeping me awake long after Greg had fallen asleep. Still, I refused to give up completely. Something inside me, a stubborn streak I didn't know I had, refused to let them win. If anything, their tactics only fueled my determination. I called a lawyer the very next day, explaining everything that had happened and asking for advice. He listened patiently, nodding occasionally as I recounted the slashed tires, the anonymous notes, and the bogus legal threats. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You've got a strong case here," he said finally. "But are you ready for what comes next? Because once you go down this road, there's no turning back." I took a deep breath, letting the weight of his words settle over me. No turning back. That phrase echoed in my head for hours afterward, a reminder of how far I'd come, and how far I still had to go. The lawsuit threat from the HOA hit me like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just some vague warning anymore. It was official, written in black and white legalese that made my stomach churn. According to their letter, I was being accused of causing undue financial hardship to the community by towing cars without proper notice and refusing to cooperate with their requests. They demanded I reimburse everyone for their towing fees, allow unlimited access to my parking lot moving forward, and issue a public apology. If I didn't comply, they'd promised to take me to court. At first, I tried to brush it off. "This is ridiculous," I muttered to Greg as I tossed the letter onto the kitchen counter. "They can't seriously expect me to pay for something I didn't do wrong." But deep down, I knew this wasn't just an idle threat. Lawsuits are messy, time-consuming, and expensive, even if you're in the right. The HOA had resources, connections, and a team of lawyers ready to drag this out for as long as possible. And while I believed I had justice on my side, fighting them would mean months, or even years, of stress, uncertainty, and sleepless nights. Greg could see the worry etched on my face. "We need to be smart about this," he said gently, pulling up a chair beside me. "Maybe we should meet them halfway. Offer to rent part of the lot formally or set some ground rules. That way, everyone wins." "No," I shot back, sharper than I intended. "They broke the law, not me. Why should I compromise when they're the ones who disrespected my property? He sighed, knowing better than to argue when I got like this. Still, his words lingered in my mind, nagging at me like a splinter I couldn't quite pull out. Was he right? Could there be a middle ground here? Or was standing firm the only option left? Determined to fight back, I hired a lawyer. Together, we drafted a response outlining my rights as a property owner and demanding the HOA cease their harassment immediately. We sent copies to every member of the association, hoping transparency would shine a light on their hypocrisy. To my surprise, it worked, to an extent. Many neighbors backed off, realizing they didn't want to risk getting dragged into a costly legal battle. Some even apologized privately, admitting they'd been caught up in Patricia's rhetoric and hadn't thought things through. But Patricia herself refused to budge. In fact, her determination seemed to intensify. She organized protests outside my house, rallying supporters with picket signs bearing slogans like "Private PRP" or "We do ESNT mean Private to Iran." Cars slowed down as they passed, occupants glaring at me like I was public enemy number one. Reporters showed up too, eager to turn my private dispute into a sensational headline. Microphones were shoved in my face, cameras flashed, and questions flew fast and furious. Do you regret your decision to tow the cars? How has this affected your relationship with your neighbors? What do you think this says about modern society? Through it all, I held my ground, repeating the same simple truth over and over again. This is my property. I have every right to decide who uses it. Still, the toll it took on me was undeniable. Nights became restless, filled with tossing and turning as scenarios played out in my head. What if they won in court? What if this dragged on forever? Anxiety gnawed at me during the day too, making it hard to focus on work or enjoy even the simplest moments of peace. Friends stopped calling because they didn't know what to say, and family members grew concerned, urging me to consider settling just to end the madness. One evening, after another long day of dealing with reporters and angry neighbors, I found myself sitting alone in the warehouse. The space that had once felt like freedom now felt suffocating, weighed down by the conflict raging around it. For the first time, I let myself cry, not out of weakness, but out of sheer exhaustion. Fighting for what was right shouldn't feel this lonely, I thought bitterly. But quitting wasn't an option either. Not now. Not when so much was at stake. As tears streamed down my face, I realized something important. This wasn't just about my parking lot anymore. It was about standing up for myself in a world where people often try to take advantage of kindness. Giving in wouldn't solve anything. It would only prove them right. So, no matter how hard it got, I vowed to keep going. Because sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones worth fighting. The turning point came unexpectedly, and it wasn't because of anything I did. It was thanks to Mr. Harlan, the quiet handyman who lived 2 blocks away. He'd always been a mystery to the neighborhood, with his scruffy beard, oil-stained jeans, and habit of tinkering with old tools in his garage. He seemed more like a character from a book than someone you'd strike up a conversation with at a block party. But one evening, as I sat on my porch nursing a cup of tea after another exhausting day of protests and reporters, he appeared out of nowhere. "I brought you cookies," he said gruffly, holding out a brown paper bag. His tone was awkward, almost shy, but there was kindness in his eyes that caught me off guard. "Cookies," I repeated, blinking in surprise. "Why?" He shrugged, shifting uncomfortably under my gaze. "Figured you could use some cheering up." I hesitated for a moment before taking the bag and gesturing for him to sit down. As we talked, I learned that Mr. Harlan had been through something similar years ago. The HOA had commandeered his garage for community events, refusing to compensate him or even ask permission. When he objected, they retaliated by fining him into bankruptcy. It took everything he had, emotionally and financially, to fight back, and even then, he barely survived the ordeal. "They'll never stop unless you hit them where it hurts," he advised, leaning forward earnestly. "Expose their hypocrisy. Show everyone exactly who Patricia Langley really is." His words stuck with me long after he left. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had a plan, a real chance to turn the tables. If the HOA thought they could bully me into submission, they were wrong. Armed with Mr. Harlan's advice, I decided to dig deeper into their operations. This wasn't just about my parking lot anymore. It was about exposing the truth. Over the next few weeks, I spent hours researching public records, filing information requests, and piecing together evidence. What I uncovered shocked me. The HOA's finances were a mess. Mismanaged funds, secret payouts to favored members, and blatant violations of state laws governing nonprofit organizations. There were unexplained expenses listed as miscellaneous that added up to thousands of dollars, along with suspicious transactions tied directly to Patricia herself. It was clear she'd been using her position not to serve the community but to enrich herself and her allies. With my lawyer's help, I compiled everything into a detailed report and filed a counter-lawsuit against the HOA, accusing them of corruption and abuse of power. We sent copies to every member, making sure everyone knew what was going on. Some neighbors were skeptical at first, dismissing my claims as exaggerations or lies. But when they saw the documents for themselves, the receipts, the bank statements, the emails, it became impossible to ignore. Patricia's reaction was immediate and explosive. She called an emergency meeting, trying desperately to spin the story in her favor. Standing before a packed room, she accused me of fabricating evidence and spreading false rumors. Her voice shook with anger, and her usual polished demeanor cracked under the weight of the scrutiny. For once, she didn't look untouchable. She looked scared. But the damage was already done. Doubts spread like wildfire among the residents. People started asking questions they'd never dared to before. Why did the HOA need so much money? Where did all those miscellaneous fees go? And why had no one noticed until now? As the days passed, support for Patricia crumbled. Even some of her closest allies began distancing themselves, unwilling to be associated with her increasingly toxic leadership. The neighborhood buzzed with whispered conversations, and for the first time, I felt like I wasn't alone in this fight. Slowly but surely, the tide was turning. Still, I knew the final battle was yet to come. Exposing the truth was only step one. Winning justice would require facing Patricia and the entire HOA in court. But for the first time in months, I felt hopeful. The pieces were falling into place, and I was ready to see this through to the end. The aftermath of the court ruling felt like stepping out of a storm and into sunlight, warm but disorienting. The neighborhood, once buzzing with tension and hostility, fell eerily quiet. Patricia's resignation left the HOA scrambling to pick up the pieces, and for weeks their meetings were canceled as they tried to regroup. Some neighbors avoided me altogether, embarrassed by their role in the conflict, while others approached me hesitantly, offering awkward apologies. "We didn't know," was the phrase I heard most often. It wasn't enough to erase everything that had happened, but it was a start. With Patricia gone, the new interim president, a soft-spoken man named Mr. Thompson, took a different approach. He called a community meeting to address the issues head-on, promising transparency and reform. For the first time, people openly discussed the problems within the HOA: favoritism, unchecked power, and a lack of accountability. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but there was hope in the air, a fragile, cautious hope that things could get better. As for my warehouse, I decided to put up a tall fence around the parking lot, complete with a locked gate and a sign that read "Private Property. No trespassing." It wasn't just about keeping cars out. It was a boundary, both literal and symbolic. When I pulled into the newly secured lot for the first time, I couldn't help but smile. It felt like reclaiming not just my space, but also my peace of mind. Still, the scars of the battle lingered. Friends who had supported me early on drifted away, unsure how to navigate the fallout. Others stopped inviting me to neighborhood gatherings, leaving me feeling isolated despite living surrounded by people. Greg reminded me often that healing takes time, and he was right. It did. But some wounds run deep, and trust isn't easily rebuilt. One day, as I was working inside the warehouse, there was a knock at the door. To my surprise, it was Mr. Harlan, holding another brown paper bag. This time, it smelled faintly of cinnamon. "Cookies again," he said with a small smile. "Thought you might need something sweet after all this." I laughed softly, inviting him in. We talked for hours, sharing stories and reflecting on everything that had happened. He admitted he'd never expected me to take the fight as far as I did. "Most folks would have backed down," he said. "You stood your ground when it mattered. That's rare." His words stayed with me long after he left. They reminded me why I'd fought so hard, not just for myself, but for anyone else who might face similar injustice. Standing up against the HOA wasn't just about winning. It was about proving that fairness matters, even when it's easier to look the other way. In the months that followed, life slowly returned to normal, or at least a new kind of normal. The protests stopped, the anonymous notes disappeared, and the late-night headlights ceased. My tires stayed intact, and my windows remained egg-free. The media lost interest, moving on to bigger stories, and the neighborhood began to heal in its own quiet way. But every now and then, I'd catch someone staring at me from across the street, or hear whispers fade as I walked by. Old habits die hard, and I knew it would take time for the stigma to fade completely. Still, I chose to focus on the positives. The lessons I'd learned, the strength I'd discovered within myself, and the knowledge that sometimes doing the right thing means standing alone. Now, whenever I unlock the gate to my parking lot, I pause for a moment to appreciate how far I've come. It's more than just asphalt and painted lines. It's proof that justice, no matter how hard fought, is always worth pursuing. And though the road ahead may still hold challenges, I face them with a renewed sense of resilience. Because here's the truth, life doesn't hand you victories wrapped in ribbons. Sometimes, you have to fight for them tooth and nail. And when you do, the reward isn't just what you gain, it's knowing you refuse to give up, even when the odds were stacked against you.